Let me ask you a question which sounds simple, yet might take a while to answer and think through. What makes a nation? What makes a society? Is it confession, as one may have mainly concluded 300 years ago? If you are European, you may know of our history and how over the course of several centuries the borders of nations were determined by religious affiliation of its peoples, kings and lords. To this day, some European nations are split through confession, and religious conflicts between different confessions persist to this very day. Or is it language? Is that the determining factor in what shapes a nation? This is probably the factor by which 19th century civic nationalists would have determined it. French speakers united in one French nation, and those who speak German united under one German nation under one German language. And following through that line of thought, many within the latter half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century concluded and professed that the determining factor in what makes a nation is culture. That what binds a nation into one and unites and makes a society is a uniting culture. Or do you believe that it is race and ethnicity that makes a nation and shapes a society into one? Personally, I reject all these notions and will try my best to explain within this video why I believe that to be. The idea of uniting a nation around confession died with the kings who professed to have God's authority to enforce God's divine law. Confession as a unifying factor within a society is an authoritarian model, and as such a society united around faith is no substitute for liberty. Uniting a nation around language hits its limitations when you realize that nations that previously existed on the basis of being unified through language, from the British Empire to the Spanish Empire, collapsed into revolt. A continent can't be ruled by a peninsula or an island, and having a uniting language is no substitute for liberty. And culture? One of the most prominent cultural revival movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the Irish Cultural Revival Movement, which arose out of a fear of Irish culture being anglicized, and which was a precursor to the nationalist Irish Revolution. Promoted in the early days at least by poets and playwrights such as William Butler Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory in the Abbey Theatre, through works such as Kathleen Ni Houlihan, the Irish Cultural Revival Movement, unlike the ones in Germany, Italy, Hungary and elsewhere, was the only one of its kind that didn't result in the rise of a fascist regime. It created a resurgence of a sense of Irishness, revived the Gaelic language, and created works of culture revered to this day. But the traditionalist, back to the roots nature of this movement didn't provide for a social framework that would combat injustice or guarantee individual liberties within that cultural framework. The widespread sexual abuse of children by the Catholic Church, the non-existent separation of church and state, the abuse of power by figures of authority, all went unpunished due to them being embedded within the revitalized cultural movement. Culture is no substitute for liberty. Neither is a racially homogeneous society a garant for any liberty, let alone a free existence. A couple of months ago, I hinted that I was intending on making a video on Swiss democracy and why I believe people should take a closer, more in-depth look at it to learn something from it. And it is within that context in which I intend to do so within a video directed at the alt-right, as well as many more people I have encountered claiming to fight for society and its preservation on ideological and tribalistic factors as their basis for unification. Switzerland is a nation of many faiths. Historically, the isolated lands within the Alps provided an ideal place for those fleeing persecution to go, from Calvinists to German Catholics to French Huguenots. Switzerland is also a nation of 4 languages: French, Italian, Retro-Romanic and German. And with that, it is also a nation of more than 4 cultures. These are all factors which would traditionally have fallen into the category of factors that would cause disunity rather than unity, at least according to the main driving political forces that have shaped Europe's nations over the course of the last 400 years. Yet despite that, the Swiss have been united not as the French, Germans or Italian population groups or as varying religious groups, but as one nation under 4 languages, several cultures, several religious confessions, yet one nation, as one Swiss people, for over 500 years as the Swiss Confederation. Without any religious, nationalistic or any other tribal conflicts driving them apart or at each other's throats, the one thing which has united this nation and its people has been a common agreement and commitment on the preservation not of some concept of culture, faith or race, or language, but of democracy and the values of a free society. The Swiss Constitution reads, First Amendment, "The peoples united through this confederation of 22 sovereign cantons form through their totality the Swiss nation." Second Amendment, "The purpose of this confederation is to ensure the independence of the fatherland from outside threats, to ensure peace and rule of law at home, to protect the liberty and rights of its citizens, and to further the wealth of the nation." Third Amendment, "The cantons are sovereign as far as their sovereignty is not limited by the Confederate Constitution, and as such they exercise rights and powers which shall not be given to the Confederacy or infringed upon by the Confederacy." Fourth Amendment, "All Swiss are equal before the law. There shall not be serfdom status within Switzerland, no special exemption in rights based on place, birth, family, or person." What I love so much about this document, besides the fact that it is one of Europe's oldest constitutions, is how it outlines a commitment to democracy and to protect the individual rights and liberties of the nation's citizens. There is no emphasis on race, faith, culture, or other tribalistic preference, but a clearly outlined commitment that what holds this nation together and what provides the framework for the existence of this nation is a common commitment by the citizens to ensure and guarantee the liberties and rights of the citizens of this society. And to me personally, that is the ideal that I strive for and which I argue for. My cause is not to ensure that my society is religiously, lingually, culturally, or ethnically homogeneous. My cause are the values and principles of a free society. Let me rephrase the question somewhat for you. If you are someone who argues for a cultural or ethnic or racially homogeneous society and uses one of these causes as your primary point of argumentation, what exactly is a purely Catholic, a purely German, or a purely white society worth when you live in a miserable existence in chains under serfdom? Whatever cause you may have written upon your flag as the prime motivator for your political and cultural engagement, none of these causes are in any way a viable substitute for liberty and the rights of man. And it has always been those who have proclaimed to fight for the preservation of the tribe who have in the end inflicted most harm upon that very tribe. The great cultural revival movements of Ireland produced what were arguably the best novelists and playwrights of the last century, yet these minds were tossed aside by those who seized the political drive for creating an Irish society, proclaiming that Irishness was deeply tied to the authority of the Catholic Church and those who owned the land, creating the nourishing ground upon which the systematic rape of children and some of the worst corruption in a European nation was made possible. And one has to almost laugh at the cranks and morons who proclaimed to preserve German culture during the first half of the 20th century. Even the slowest of minds would see through the hypocritic farce that is the burning of books in the name of preserving culture. An assembly of delusional losers and failed artists who believed that they knew what culture was, but created a pseudo-culture in its stead, whilst almost exterminating German culture itself. Same in Spain, where the Caudillo Franco banned the Catalonian language and set out on a campaign to destroy Catalan and Basque culture, which would have thereby destroyed integral parts of the very culture he proclaimed to save. No, it is always those who proclaim to be saving culture, from the here in the past to the Middle East in the present, who ended up destroying culture. Because culture is not ideological. Culture is not the servant of anyone's political whims and neuroses. Culture is an organic process. It is an expression of a society's artistic affinities and joys, not through order and systematic structured processes, but through the collective gathering together of individual actions and behaviors. It is the sum of individual actions rather than anything that could ever possibly be guided by any kind of political belief or motivation. To attempt to control culture is to attempt to control the preferences of individuals, and as such, it is destined to fail before even beginning. Someone proclaiming to be arguing or fighting for the supposed collective good, or to use the notorious phrase, the right side of history, is to be treated with the same amount of suspicion and contempt, no matter what political standing they may hold. It is the rights and freedoms of the individual that take precedence over the supposed common good, as it is the actions and the will of these multiple individuals that in the end shape society and guarantee that these rights and liberties within such a society are not undermined. I have spent my time on this channel going after Islamists, those who make apologies for the barbarities of Islam, as well as the surge of social justice nonsense. I do not engage in this for the preservation of what one may consider to be my culture, race, or ethnicity, but to preserve the values and principles upon which our free society has been built, and which at this very moment are under attack by those forces. As someone, and this is a bit of a personal note, as someone who had a black girlfriend in the past, someone who were to tell me that I should feel guilty for betraying the supposed racial integrity of my culture is no better to me than someone who would tell me to check my supposed white privilege in her presence. As such, a purely white society that has been built upon the framework of nothing more but to ensure the white purity of its population, to me is just as worthless as a caliphate.